anyone could submit an experiment idea, even if you're not on the growth team. But we built this very simple kind of one-pager framework that included an objective, hypothesis you're testing, design or resources required to execute the experiment, timeline, so how long you need the experiment to run, and then what success quantifiably looks like. So you're not actually going and having revisionist history on like, hey, it actually did work, even though, the data showed this. And then finally, the next steps that one takes if the experiment fails or succeeds.
Mike, I am so excited for this. We've known each other for a while. We've been back and forth on Twitter DM. So first, thank you so much for joining me today, Mike.
Thanks for having me, Harry. I've been a longtime listener and learned a lot from your show over the years, so thank you.
Do you know what? I really needed that ego inflation, so thank you for that. But I would love to dive in. Growth is a weird and a wonderful world. And so how did you make your way into the world of growth? And how did you come to lead the growth team at Stitchfix?
Yeah, so I'll go back and I'll start with my undergrad. So I studied engineering undergrad. I finished up University of Michigan in 2007. Most folks at that time out of engineering school were either going to work in the auto industry in Detroit or move to Chicago or New York to work in business, I'm using air quotes. Google was just kind of opening up their Ann Arbor office at the time. And, my objective when I was thinking about what I wanted to go do was really to go avoid routine, so avoid getting bored, and then go optimize for learning, which is a theme that's held true throughout most of my career. I felt like in general, I was most stimulated by starting at the base of a new learning curve, working my way up and moving to the next, kind of like engineering problem sets. And so right out of school, I joined Bain because of this pattern. I think from a distance, it felt like the breadth of problems and clients would kind of offer that. I actually had a great time. And if anything, it trained my brain to be a structured thinker. But I always wished I could have been better aligned. I could have better aligned how I spent my time with what I actually cared about or had some passion for. And so at the time, one of my colleagues at Bain went to go work for Danny Meyer and then Grant Achatz and Nick Kokonis, who were running this big restaurant group, the Alinea group.
Yeah.
I think at that time was the best restaurant in the US. And I was a food and restaurant geek. I think Chicago is like one of the best food scenes in the country. And I was always deep studying the food bloggers and tracking new restaurant openings. And I was always inspired by that. So when I moved to the Bay Area in 2011, I started looking for interesting opportunities in the food space, and we're looking at food startups. Turns out those are really hard businesses, but I ended up working at this chef marketplace called Kitchit that I fell in love with, essentially a marketplace connecting chefs at notable restaurants with diners. And it was really my first experience being the generalist athlete in a room of 5 to 10 people just trying to make stuff work early on. I didn't really know what growth was at the time, but that's kind of what I was doing. One of the things we did there is we launched this group payments product, and it was a real needle mover on conversion. And so shortly after, when I learned about this YC company, Tilt, what they were doing around building this crowdfunding or group payments API, I got really excited and I cold emailed James Becerra, who I think you know, and ultimately joined shortly after the company finished YC and raised its first round of funding from Andreessen Horowitz. Most of the company at that time was writing code, and I was kind of helped to figure out why the company was growing 20% month on month, and then help engineer things to help it grow faster. And I'm happy to share more on that Tilt journey later. But the stepping stone at that point, so our COO there, who hired me, Brian Burtwhistle, he was, I think, the first BD person at Amazon, had been around for a while, ended up being a close friend and mentor. 3.5 years later, when I was leaving Tilt, which didn't work out the way we wanted it to, he introduced me to his wife, Julie Bornstein, who was the COO at Stitchfix. The story there was they had grown on the heels of organic and strong retention for the first few years, and famously had a hard time raising venture money. So decided to just say, hey, we're going to operate on the constraints of profitability. There's a lot more color on that, but really, essentially they never had to invest in building an in-house user acquisition muscle until relatively late in the journey. So I saw it as a unique opportunity, and I was also coming off a time where I felt kind of burnt by this high growth, high burn startup failure. And so Julie kind of took the bet that I was sufficiently analytical and competent to operate at that next level of scale, and that's how I ended up there.
So, we're going to dive into a couple of different aspects there. I actually tweeted it the other day. I was 18 in San Francisco, first ever trip to the US, and I cold emailed James Becerra. Tilt was the hottest company in San Francisco at the time. And he responded and invited me for lunch at Tilt's HQ and gave me an hour and a half of advice, wisdom. I was 18, nobody. He was CEO of the hottest company in San Francisco at the time. I always remember that. What a good person. Yeah. Important to say that.
Magic. Yeah, and there was some magic in being in the Bay Area back then too. Very typical James there. So.
Totally. Listen, I want to ask, you mentioned obviously Stitch Fix there. It was a very transformational time for you and for the company. When you think about like one or two big lessons for you in terms of takeaways and how it impacted your mindset to growth from your time with Stitch Fix, what would you say those one or two lessons are?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch. The first one's probably about the importance of getting your objective function right. And so when I initially joined, there was a retention team, and there was a VP of retention who was fantastic. She was my counterpart. And then I was hired to go run acquisition. Our early emphasis on retention meant that we had a strong understanding of our users and really an amazing foundation to add acquisition to. But with a structure like this, teams ended up thinking, less holistically, and they really were focused on tools that they had within their disposal to move one particular metric. And so if I viewed my metric as new users in CAC, I could have destroyed her retention metric downstream by just letting in kind of shitty quality users and optimizing for an affiliate channel or something like that. And so I think, it's important for teams to have a holistic view of what growth actually means for that business. For us, redefining our KPI to some down funnel metric was really impactful. And so there's more color on that I could go into later, but I think that the meta point there is kind of getting your objective function right. I think as a related point to that, many companies today start doing things to grow without really having an understanding of their growth model or a holistic understanding of it. And so I think growth could be really detrimental if you're not focused on moving the right set of metrics. And that's a really important point that's kind of been etched in me since then. I think the second point, which is a little bit more tactical, and it's really around the importance of understanding incrementality. This is specific to paid marketing, but I mean, Stitchfix had a lot of data science DNA from Netflix, and that was instilled in the company. One of the things Netflix, uniquely did was they were pretty fancy at running at-scale performance marketing. Everything they did was all their measurement was based on these holdout tests. They didn't use any precise attribution models. I think many growth marketers aim for this, almost a false sense of precision to give credit to a conversion on any one channel or any fractional set of channels. Oftentimes that's just false precision. And so even though we were highly analytical at Stitch Fix, we realized that marketing is rarely really direct response. And the best way to really quantify efficacy is to measure lift by doing some version of holdout testing. And so that one's more tactical, but I think so many people could actually expect almost false precision out of paid marketing, and that was a really important learning there.
No, I love that in terms of the tactical, and we're going to go into the tactical later. I want to touch on number one there, because really a lot of it centers around ambiguity of growth, your growth model, and how you think about what growth really means in your organization. I think there's a lot of, again, this series is for founders building growth teams or hiring their first growth leaders. Yep. And I think there's a lot of ambiguity there. What does the role of head of growth mean, Mike?
Yeah. So I might give you, you're right, it's very inconsistent. I kind of prefer a broad definition, which is someone who's responsible for two things. One is accelerating a company's pace of learning. This is typically done through experiments, but that's a very important piece. Essentially the growth team and the head of growth should be operating at a faster drumbeat than the company and bring those learnings back into kind of the core product and what's actually happening. And the second description might be, engineering systems that help a company build more control over its North Star metrics. And so that's when I look at a head of growth, that's kind of more what I look for. And I understand that definition might be a little bit vague, but I think that could apply to product marketing, sales, other stuff.
Can I ask, just so I can understand, if we think about increasing a pace of learning, what's an example of that?
All right, here's a good example. If you look at paid marketing, and if you think about what a marketing team might be looking to do is set up a set of kind of different landing pages to actually capture different forms of intent and better convert users, right? And so you could actually, one way of actually capturing learnings on conversion would be to just throw up a page, send organic traffic through it, and just see what happens. I think the role of a paid marketing team here, or a growth team, could actually be, hey, we're actually going to go up funnel, spend money in the spirit of learning, and actually drive much more traffic through a set of ads that are actually testing different messaging that will eventually roll up into our landing pages. So that's a very tactical one, but that's one example. I think maybe the better answer is more of a kind of a general point, which is I think the way most organizations are structured have some form of dependencies. You have an engineering team, a product team, a marketing team, et cetera. I think part of the magic of cross-functional growth pods, which is generally the structure I prefer, is you can actually be fully autonomous in going and running an experiment to validate or invalidate a hypothesis without actually needing to step in the roadmap of other teams in a company. These are problems that happen more at scale, but that's more the kind of the kind of sense of what I'm looking for.
Oh, you dropped in a little pearl there in terms of your preference being a cross-functional team, because this was my other big question. I have a lot of founders be like, where does it fit into my org? Is it a standalone? Is it in product? Is it in marketing? Why do you prefer cross-functional? Why is that better? And what's the right structure?
Yeah, so it's interesting. There's one meta point we talk about at Reforge, which is a great, education program and set of content around growth. But one point that I very much agree with is like, if the practice of growth is successful, it should eventually abstract itself away and just be how product and marketing are run. So this is a discipline that I think can be instilled into other functions, but sometimes, having a standalone growth team might not be the best long-term answer. So I just want to caveat all this stuff with that up front. But yes, there is a role in many companies' journeys where it's really important, and it might be the most pragmatic solution. So I think, there's typically two structures. There's like single function, which is actually how we had it at Stitchfix, which is, some VP of acquisition with different channel directors reporting to that. This is more common for e-commerce companies or ones where it's a pretty straightforward or linear conversion funnel. The second model, which I kind of just referenced, is a cross-functional pod where you have a PM, an engineer, marketing, analytics, design, user research, working on shared business problems. Typically, the PM might be kind of like the most accountable person on that pod, but in general, those are like everyone's taking different disciplines and working towards the shared objective. I think where it sits is...
Can I just ask, sorry, on that cross-functional, so there's no actual like growth team, you're just asking for a growth mindset within the PMs, or they are actually a separate team?
No, sorry, yeah. What I was referring to was a growth team there. So that would be the way the growth team is structured. You would have a head of growth and various different PMs, and then those other functions, engineers or whatever, either dotted lining in or actually sitting within the growth team.
Gotcha. Okay. Totally get you.
Think about it. Yeah. And so where it sits, which was your first question, it's kind of an age-old question, and I should just say many companies are going to see this change quite a bit over time. I remember Casey Winters is a good friend. I think you've had him on the pod, and like I remember at Pinterest, that would switch over like quite a bit between marketing and product. So I think many successful companies have growth reporting into the CEO, and this is important given that. You oftentimes need a blessing to just go run really aggressive tactics, and dependencies, like I said, could really hinder a growth team. And so the one way to solve that is just have it roll into the CEO. Between marketing and product, because the CEO at a certain scale, it might not be practical for that to be the case. I typically say this work better under product. I think many sustainable growth programs require with engineering and product discipline. Marketing really only makes sense for e-commerce companies where the product is like simple and linear. You're likely going to have a performance marketing team sit within marketing, and that's fine. And sometimes that's used interchangeably with growth marketing. But if we're talking about growth programs that are going to touch the product, I think it's much more ideal to have it sit under product.
I totally agree. I think the biggest mistake that I see within portfolio companies within growth teams is growth teams come in, bluntly tinker with code and then fuck off. And engineering teams are like, what? And so having that lock in together means there's a lot more alignment early on as to why you're doing what you're doing and how you do it to prevent that. So totally agree. The next question is, okay, so let's say we put it under product. I see a lot of people actually go, and this is interesting, go too soon on growth teams and look at it as a silver bullet for product market fit even. How do you think about when's the right time to make your first growth hire?
I get asked this question a lot in new gig as a venture capitalist. I think there's a few principles I think about here, and there's no one size fits all answer. But I think one principle that for sure is true is like never hire a growth person pre-product market fit. I do think it's okay to have generalist athletes at this point, but they should really be talking with users and aggressively trying to find product market fit. And sometimes like people who might have growth-ish backgrounds could be helpful on that, but they should not be running a growth team at that stage. I think prematurely scaling top of funnel before you have a cohort of users that's really retained and also understanding who those users are, like that could be detrimental to a company. And so for sure agree with you on that point. The second, I think analytics is a really necessary foundation for this. And so, one question that's related to what you're asking is, who's your first growth hire? What should they look like? I think for me, my first growth hire is typically an analytics person. In Silicon Valley, we talk about the concept of tech debt. I think that's widely understood. I think analytics debt is just as common, if not more common. I've had a lot of success hiring people from BizOps teams out of a company like LinkedIn or kind of elsewhere who are really kind of SQL proficient, maybe, engineering or stats backgrounds or math backgrounds, but they still understand the business context. And so to be clear, this is not a data scientist. These are people that actually are analysts, but also are technical enough to be laying a lot of the analytics engineering foundation. I think eventually you should have PM see instrumentation as part of the core product development process and not rely on a separate team. But in the early days, I think having analytics to really help demystify the current state of affairs, that's really helpful.
Can I ask Mike, sorry, can I just interrupt you? Analytics debt, what is it? And for me, with you advising me as an early stage founder, what can I do to make sure that I have the right data foundations or analytics foundations for you to come in and do your job properly? What should I set up for you?
Yeah, I mean, a good indicator of analytics debt is if I come in and ask a very basic question, say, show me, last month's cohort of users and kind of how they're retaining a D30, for instance, not being able to answer that question in a simple way, or a series of questions that one should be able to answer, or there being a really high cost to go answer those questions, like someone needs to go do a custom query of the database and it takes a few days, like that's a good indicator that you have analytics debt. In general, it's being way too hard or costly to answer questions about how the business is performing.
So if I'm a founder, I've got Google Analytics set up. Is that enough for you?
So that's the problem. A lot of people go to visualization tools and Google Analytics is a little bit different, but say, Looker or Mixpanel, whatever, like they go to visualization tools and say, hey, we have dashboards, like we have our problem solved. The reality is garbage in, garbage out. I think poor instrumentation of a product is actually a very common problem here. And so what I mean by instrumentation is like, if you're not actually capturing key user events in the product, it's maybe simplest to understand this in e-commerce, right? Like add to cart, checkout, revisit site, et cetera. But for like social products, it's much more challenging. If you're not actually logging the right events there, then you have no idea what's happening inside your product, and you can't start working on growth until you have that lens. So.
Can I ask, you work with many different companies now, and this is very off schedule, but when you think about who's done analytics the best and why, who's done it the best and what did they do to be so good at it?
That's a good question. I'm tempted to give the answer, like, I won't give the answer Facebook because, like, I think, late state, they have a fantastic analytics team. And actually their VP growth, Alex Schultz, who was an advisor at Tilt, was lucky to learn from him, was VP analytics there as well. And so these two functions are often cousins. One of the businesses that I'm a huge fan of that I was involved, like I knew Max early on, like Fair is a great business. And I think like they had, again, it's maybe a little bit easier for a marketplace business where you're ultimately looking at transaction data versus, social actions, which become a lot harder. I'm not close to as many like modern consumer social companies that have a good answer for that now. But I think if I look at Fair and think about what were the indicators early on when we were talking that showed me they were really healthy on analytics, it was, if you look at the dashboards and kind of what they're reporting out on, it's just very high signal and noise. And so they are, rather than going and tracking everything and reporting on everything, it was, here's actually the 3 things that matter to our business. And this is what we're going to like have rigor on reporting on every month. And I think like, looking at, I'm not an investor in the company, caveat, but I was close to that journey early on. Dan Hockenmeyer there currently runs analytics and is a friend, and I know he harps on like growth models. I think they clearly had this set early on, and I think that propagated through their dashboards and everything else. So
I think so. I totally agree with you. I think Max is great. Sadly, not a fucking investor there either. Shame. But my question to you is like, you mentioned kind of the dashboarding and the analytics that they have. I think the big problem that I see often with a lot of early stage founders is they don't really know what their core number is. And what I mean by that is what their North Star is. Yeah. How do you advise founders on trying to understand what their North Star should be?
It's a tricky problem, and I think it will evolve over time for a company. I think one of the things, again, that harp on at Reforge, but I think is generally important across companies is actually having a growth model. And oftentimes this starts by just getting into a spreadsheet, or actually pre-spreadsheet, write down how your product actually grows, right? And how it should grow. So for a business like Pinterest, and there's a concept called growth loops that maybe we could talk about later, but like new users coming in, go and post new, get brought in by existing content, go and post new content, which feeds the SEO engine and kind of drives more users there. And so maybe for a business like that, at some point in time, it's probably number of pins or kind of like active pinners at any given time. I'm not sure exactly what it is today, but I think like the point is having just a conceptual understanding of like, what is the mechanic of your business that actually is driving kind of the main metric that you care about. For most businesses, it ultimately ladders up to revenue. For some, it might be users early on. Like that, just writing it down before you actually get into a spreadsheet is important.
It's interesting. I did this with the show actually, because I have funds business and I have the media business, and the only thing that matters for me is the quality of guests on the show. So if we start at number one, quality of guests leads to more listeners leads to more founders wanting to take my money, more founders wanting to take my money leads to more investors, LPs wanting to give me money, and that feeds back into the core business. And so it's this circle of life. And so when I'm stressed, I'm like, fucking great guess. That's all that matters.
Yeah,
and it's
that's your growth move, Perry. I mean, and there's going to be, this actually is a good one to dig into, because like at a certain point in time, maybe early on, it's just like, getting guests that have over a certain threshold of audience is probably like what your North Star metric for the first couple of years. And then later, there might actually be like a guest retention metric to actually get their next audience on as their own reach is expanding. And then as eventually kind of converting listeners to hosts, to guests might actually be like another kind of conversion metric that you care about later. And so probably over your lifetime, there's going to be different North Star metrics. And I think this is actually a good example to illustrate that.
I think the hardest thing with I'm just ranting here. The hardest thing with my business is like, it's a new economy startup in the way that I need a head of YouTube, I need a head of Instagram, I need a head of TikTok. These are all very specific disciplines that actually are relatively new skills. And so and if you're really good at them, you have your own YouTube channel. So it's tough in that way. But I want to go back to this hiring process. So we have this fantastic person, and we know that we want someone with a more analytical mind, as you said, kind of an analyst style. I've never hired anyone in this process before, so I'd love your help. What is the right process in terms of structure to hire this first growth person? What should those stages look like?
Yeah, well, we could talk about it like it's like kind of a linear, very clean process. Oftentimes there's a lot of randomness to this, but let's go through it anyway. I think, step one is defining success, right? And so you kind of got at this with your last question, but a lot of growth hires will ultimately fail in part because the company doesn't have a clear idea of what they're hiring for. And so the fail case is, hey, we have a great product. Now let's go hire someone to help us grow it. And this might be true, but founders need to get a step more specific on what success or failure looks like for the role. So even if it's not a set of specific KPIs out of the gates, what are the outcomes or systems they want to be in place? So it could be, hey, we want our growth model by month 3, or like it's more of an analytics person, et cetera. So defining success is kind of step one. I think step 2 is calibrating. So determine some set of companies with relevant growth patterns to yours. So, for you, it might be other kind of, creator or kind of like content-oriented businesses, and go have calibration conversations with early growth leaders there. And so at Tilt, for instance, like we knew that our growth playbook was going to be community by community. So we went to talk to early leaders at different products that grew city by city or community by community. So Grubhub, Uber, Postmates, et cetera. The goal is really to build an intuitive sense of like what great looks like. And sometimes those people end up being poachable. And so that's an important step as well. The third, writing a job spec and then the exercise. The spec oftentimes, as you know, like the best leads are not kind of like cold applying on your site, but writing the spec actually forces clarity on what one is looking for.
Can I ask, I'm interested. What makes a good spec? I never see good specs.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think there's 2 goals. Like one is you are marketing the opportunity to people and getting them interested, right? Including marketing them to your investor network and people that are going to want to go and circulate them. And so half of it's probably just, underscoring what a unique opportunity and moment in time this is for the business, and then explaining why there's a set of growth challenges that are really interesting to work on there. The second piece is actually forcing some, like, I do believe that there is still some benefit to articulating, like, what a good kind of fit for the company in that particular role looks like. And so maybe the different facets of it could be a specific experience that you want one to have. I think this gets a little bit tactical, but like if you're hiring someone, if you know that you're going to be a performance marketing heavy company and you're actually starting to hire someone who's been operating at scale, there's probably certain filters where like you don't want someone who's just been doing sales or product to be your head of performance marketing, right? So there are different filtering mechanisms there. I think defining what success looks like, this could actually be written in a way that's specific to your company. And so maybe culturally, you actually need someone who's going to come in and be very aggressive and kind of go and challenge preconceived notions of how things are done. And actually putting that in the spec does filter out for certain like types of personalities.
So if we have this growth spec now and we take it out, we put it on LinkedIn and Twitter and everywhere, give it through our investor networks, all this. Okay, so now we have like leads come in, which is kind of slightly dehumanizing, but say leads come in. How do we structure that process, and how do we make sure that we run an efficient hiring process once leads are in?
Yeah. All right. So again, in my experience, there's not that many people out there that that understand this stuff like that well. And so I do think like you're either taking a bet on someone that hasn't done growth before, and that's all of us were there at some point, or you're probably not running a very high volume process. And so I think of this as like, I would much rather be targeted. And I think in getting the spec out there, I kind of skip this, but like, I don't think of it as, hey, we put it on the website and then we see who comes in. It's you're sending it to investors and close friends in your network, as well as target growth communities, maybe like a Reforge or something. I don't think it's like going to be a very high volume of leads for most roles. And so one thing that I like to do early on, and you obviously have a fantastic network, you go and reference early in the process, and you could get like really important signals on people with reference calls. Obviously, you want to respect the candidate's confidentiality, but there are ways to actually, kind of just, I think one of the biggest mistakes people make is doing references too late and kind of treating it as a formality. Doing them early on, I think, is a great way to kind of filter. And then I think, there are a few, once you actually do get people in process, I do think there's a role for like early filtering questions before kind of like a broader exercise later. And so one, I think, one of the questions I really like to ask people is pick your favorite product and tell me how it grows. It's a really simple question, but it kind of gets at whether someone understands like the system and is able to think holistically versus specifying just one case study or one anecdote. And it also covers both like left and right brain thinking. And so most systems should be grounded in both quantitative and user psychology. And I think that's, this is, that's like one good question to ask for that. And so you could actually even ask that before someone actually, comes in the door, just as a filter to see if someone actually is thinking the way you want. And then there's a bunch of exercise questions I'm happy to talk about later.
Well, I want, before we dive on the exercises, I love that in terms of, pick your favorite product and tell me how it grows. I was thinking for a minute, shit, what would I answer? My question to you though is like, what other questions are there? Because I have founders and they're like, what else do I ask? So are there some others which really just, like that question, can reveal a little bit more about the quality of the candidate?
What I'm about to say in some ways is a cliche interview question, but I think it's important for growth, which is like, tell me about a time you failed and what happened from that. I think for growth, one of the important things that you're looking for is someone who's not afraid to fail, right? Failure is part of the experimentation process. And actually like the worst thing one could do in a growth role is go and try to cover up failures or just like not acknowledge they happen, because what an opportunity to learn. And I think that's like, you were looking for someone's risk appetite, but then kind of appetite to go and just put themselves in the stream of learnings that oftentimes come from failure, and then go iterate on that. And so that's one. There's a few that get a step more tactical, which is like, show me your daily dashboard is one that I like. This maybe gets a little bit deeper, and it can be used in an exercise. It could also be used in a live kind of conversation where you just ask someone to write it out on paper. But you're looking for someone who's analytical in nature with high signal and noise, and is able to tie data back to a business context. And if they're too complex or like, showing too many metrics or they're unwieldy with it, that could be a red flag. So those are another couple ones I like. I mean, there's a much longer list, but I think hearing specific anecdotes through references and actually through experiences they had in the seat, ultimately those are most important, and getting as specific as possible is kind of just general guidance.
So I really like those three questions as like a foundational layer. You mentioned exercises there as well. When we think about tests or exercises, what can we do to go a little bit deeper to assess that quality, and what are we looking for in those tests and exercises?
Yeah, so there's a couple more that are really an extension of what we're talking about. So one that I like is bring me a prioritize experiment roadmap for X feature, right? One of the important points of running a growth team is like, you need to have a system on triaging different experiment ideas and really having an ROI mindset. So some people are going to come in and bring a laundry list of everything they want to go test down to like button colors without having a system or some higher order context. And sometimes I think that's a fail case actually for kind of a new head of growth. You just come in and say, hey, I want to have an impact. I'm just going to go and test everything and be the A/B tester. And if you're doing that without kind of like, high order context of what's actually going to move the needle on a business, that's problematic. And so prioritization of an experiment roadmap is one way of getting at that.
Like, if I'm a founder, how do I do that? Do I give them a problem and tell them to figure out the growth model around that problem? Like, can you just help me? Literally, I'm really thick.
Yeah, sure. So let's think about it. So, all right, I'll go back to Facebook, right? Because great growth team early on. Like, I know that one of the things they actually put the growth team on was when they spun out Messenger from the core app. It was the growth team that actually ran the product on that early on to like drive a bunch of adoption to it, right? And so one thing, one question there could be, and it actually, this is separate from going and writing a whole growth model, although it's probably helpful context to have one in place. But if you actually say, hey, your job is to come in and actually grow DAUs on Messenger from X to Y, what's your 3-month roadmap on how to go and do that? And so that's how it
got you totally. Yep. No, that makes total sense. Yep. Are there any other exercises that we would do to understand quality?
Yeah, I think writing the growth model is one, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, but kind of write out a growth model for X product. And if you know, it should be relevant to the business that you're running. So if you're running a marketplace company, have it be another marketplace business, just so people understand like the set of levers and the interplay for that particular type of business.
Do we give them time for these exercises? Because it takes some cognitive load.
Yeah.
Do we expect them to do it in the room with us?
This is debatable. I always do. I think, and call it, a few days, and you could say, hey, don't take more than a few hours on this. If you're testing for kind of like ability to produce this stuff on the fly, it's another set of skills you're looking for. I think there's value to that, and maybe like the dashboard question might be relevant on that. But I think for something like this, for these last two, I think you should give them time. Yeah, I mean, for a model like this, really you're looking to make sure they could think holistically, that they could think in terms of loops and kind of visualize growth into a spreadsheet. Maybe what might be a flag here is if they're just bringing a pure kind of financial model or something that's like overly kind of like daunting or unwieldy. That's probably problematic. You really want people in this seat who are simplifiers.
So we have this incredible candidate. We've been through the questions, we've been through the tests, and now I want to offer them a role. I don't know how to put a package together for a growth hire. I know it's dependent, but like just to help me just understand what the range looks like for founders, how should a compensation package look for a first growth hire?
Yeah, it's hard. Like, what stage are you thinking here? Because it's gonna vary by stage.
I think you're probably Series B, C, because we're post product market fit. We're probably 20 million plus in funding, having raised Series B, C.
Yeah, this is more of a general kind of comment, but I like being more generous with equity like early on. And I think cash, at our current point in time, we're talking end of January 2023. These numbers are very like dynamic, especially on the cash side, as we're entering a particular point in the cycle. And I will give one comment on comp before getting into it, just how I think about it. But like one principle I like going back to, Keith Rabois gave this awesome talk like 8 years ago at Startup School on being a great operator. One point that always resonated was around barrels versus ammunition. I don't know if you've heard this before.
No.
But he basically states that all companies need high quality people in both ammunition roles and then barrel roles. But no matter how much ammunition you have, if you only have 5 barrels, you can only do 5 things simultaneously, right? And so as you're hiring people, just keep an eye out for who those barrels are. And when you find one, do everything in your power to keep them engaged, throw more responsibility at them, more equity, whatever, et cetera, because that's ultimately determining how much you can get done as a business and how fast you can move. And so I think like heads of growth, in my experience, and obviously I have some bias here, but like great growth people, especially those who join early, can be those barrels that a company really needs. And I think, I'll go back to FAIR, like Olivia was the first kind of PM there, and early on initially led growth, and then eventually like most roles in the company over some point in time. Like a lot of companies have this individual, and they're oftentimes not like as publicly talked about or whatever, but they were the first barrel in that company. And when you find that person, man, you do whatever it takes to kind of keep them around, because they'll probably hire other barrels too.
Can I ask salary range? Just hit me with some. I tweeted today, so I'm going to be direct with you. I tweeted today, founders, when you are asked for your revenue, if you start with anything but a number, you are wrong.
Yeah, I'm trying to not get myself in trouble here too. But yeah, sure. I mean, I don't. All right, Series B company, someone who's kind of, probably mid-career, right? Because you actually don't want to hire execs too early on, but it's also not someone who's, a few years out of school. Probably you could go between 150 and 250 in salary. And then maybe like a sliding scale, between cash and kind of equity. And I think equity could go up to, I mean, I don't know, for a Series B company, I mean, at the high end, these people could be getting, north of a point. I think if you're already Series B and you've taken some dilution already, it might be shy of that. Call it, but you should be willing to part with, half a point to a point, I think, for people like this.
I thought the salary would be higher, actually, if I'm honest. But that's fascinating. No, listen, and I totally get the ranges there. And so, there's the caveat of, the ranges.
Yeah,
so
look, I mean, I think there was a period of time when, through personal experience, right? Like, I mean, these things get up to, it could be north of 300. Typically, that happens a little bit later when a business is like more proven. I think, as you're saying that, you're right. 150 is probably on the low end, and that would be someone quite probably junior who might actually opt for more equity. Maybe you go up to a point and a quarter. But yeah, I think like I would be hesitant if someone were asking for a whole lot more than like the high end of that range for a company that's like not really proven yet. Again, I might have a bias towards like more of the companies I work with are like a little bit earlier, but yeah, maybe it's maybe 300 is the top end of that range, but certainly anything north of that would be problematic, I think.
You said about loops there, and you said about loops before in our conversation, and it took me to a sentence that you said to me before, which is the importance of operationalizing growth as a set of loops versus funnels. Yep. Can you help me? What is a loop? What's an example of one?
Yeah. All right. So growth loops are a concept that again, I've referenced Reforge a few times. It was popularized there. And I have to drop Greylock here for a moment because Kevin Kwok and Casey Winters, two of the people that kind of like made this concept, and they were at Greylock at the time, also working on Reforge. I think in general, the definition for loops is like they're closed systems where the inputs through some process generate more of an output than reinvested back into the input. And so there's different types of loops. I referenced the content one from Pinterest early on. That's actually a good example. Like a user onboarding and using the product generates the output of that, generates more content that goes and feeds back into the search algorithms that is the input into acquiring new users, right? And so like that, like basically usage begets more usage, new users beget more users, like that's really the concept that you're looking for. And so loops, they're powerful because they lead to compounding growth systems versus typically funnels, are more linear growth trajectories that will oftentimes decay with scale. And so the way to engineer loops oftentimes involves kind of product efforts versus just marketing. And that's when we talk about growth, that's a concept that's kind of fundamental to it.
So totally get that in terms of the circularity of loops and how it feeds back into each other. What's a funnel then, just so I have that clearly?
Yeah, I mean, that's the traditional way that marketers think is funnels. So just looking at, it's a very common way of just looking at the path of marketing or growing a business. So one framework, I think this might be Dave McClure's, but it's the Pirate framework, R, AARRR. So top of funnel really starts with awareness, then acquisition, activation, retention, revenue, and some might add referral to the end. The problem with this is this leads to siloed teams. Typically, brand marketing might do the awareness stuff, then you have performance marketing doing acquisition, and then that might get handed off to some conversion PM that's working on activation. And so you're really missing opportunities to have interplay between these steps and go and reinvest outputs from one step into the other. For some businesses, again, like e-commerce stores, like it's just the most practical way to look at a business. So it's not like, funnels are bad all the time. But I think if you look at your growth this way, you will typically see a degradation of performance with scale. And that's ours, probably the best, the most common framework for funnels. Yep.
So when you say about operationalizing growth as a set of loops versus funnels, what does that mean now we know what loops and funnels are?
Yeah. All right. So when I think about the practice of growth, it's about like building distribution strategy into your product strategy, and then finding harmony between products, channels, and monetization. And so this is very different than saying, hey, we have a product team that's going and building stuff, and then we have a growth team, whether that be marketing or sales or whatever, going and growing stuff. And I think like the whole practice of growth is about like, creating more harmony and actually introducing distribution strategy into your product. And so part of getting at this is org structure, right? So as I mentioned before, structuring an org around a funnel creates silos, and teams will optimize at the expense of one another. And so I gave the Stitchfix example of like, hey, I could send a bunch of shitty quality leads through, and then retention is hit. So when your company thinks in terms of loops, teams are forced to think about the interplay between different components. And so it's less about road mapping tactics to reach some local optima on a specific metric, and more about seeking these compounding results. And so most teams decide that cross-functional teams are kind of the best solution, And this is a core part of operationalizing, because I think these cross-disciplinary teams also come up with better ideas. But the other things that might kind of fall under your operationalizing is going and redefining new interim metrics and saying, hey, like this is actually something that lives between acquisition and retention, but this is actually going to be, this maps more closely to the North Star of our business, and this is what we're going to try to move.
If we think about optimizing loops, we need to build this habit of experimentation and iteration within the business and learning. How do we build a process around that? Because there's a lot of kind of buzzwords there, iteration, experimentation. How do we do that?
Okay. Yeah. So there's two principles, I try to emphasize before getting into the mechanics of how you run this process. I think one is the best ideas could come from anywhere within the org. So reducing friction to bring forth ideas is something that I think the head of growth should think of themselves as responsible for. And the second is the only real failure is not implementing learnings from an experiment. So you need to have a culture where it's actually okay to take risks and fail in the spirit of learning. Any process could sometimes be have a negative connotation as, hey, it slows you down, and sometimes people that are hyper aggressive and want to move fast end up being process averse. So really, when I think about process here, it's designed to ensure we're working on the right set of things and are then going and compounding learnings. It's not to force unnecessary approval layers or slow us down. So I think mechanically, the process I've introduced in both the companies I led growth for, there's kind of four main components of it. So I think first is experiment one-pagers. So anyone could submit an experiment idea. Anyone, even if you're not on the growth team. But we built this very simple kind of one-pager framework that included an objective, hypothesis you're testing, the design or resources required to execute the experiment, timeline, so how long you need the experiment to run, and then what success quantifiably looks like. So you're not actually going and having revisionist history on hey, it actually did work, even though, the data showed this. And then finally, the next steps that one takes if the experiment fails or succeeds. So when you have that one pager, those ultimately fall into a triage list, which is most of the time just a Google sheet. So in one spreadsheet, anyone in the company could go and look at a prioritized list of experiments and see what's running at any given time, what were the results of ones that ran in the past, and also, the head of growth and the growth team should be triaging these. And so one framework that's used to triage that's common is the ICE framework. So impact, confidence, level of effort. You score every idea on these three attributes, and it's a little bit rough, but that kind of prevents the test everything mindset and the stuff that is the right balance between high impact, but maybe not high cost and a reasonable level of confidence that it might work. Those will rise to the top.
I love that in terms of the experimentation one pager. I haven't actually seen that structure before, and so I love that. Yep. I also think it's great because the biggest problem I see is growth teams come in and try to experiment on things that have already been experimented on, but because there's no documentation, it's they didn't know it happened at all. My question to you is, when you think about documentation and codifying the lessons, the learnings from those experiments, how do you think is the right way to do this? Is this a Notion doc? Is this a Coda doc? Is it a weekly meeting that just the growth team sit in on? How does that work?
Yeah. So 2P, it's good. These were actually the last two steps of the process I was going to get at, which is I think having, so we would do weekly experiment reviews as a growth team. Every week we had a meeting on completed experiments or anything that completed over the past week. The PM or whoever was responsible for it would go in and present on that. Lessons learned, implications, and then go and suggestions for other functions too that were sitting around the table there. And then we would use that form to go and kick off new experiments, right? And so anything that was going to go live or that was kind of in process, we would go and discuss those too. So that's within the growth team. I think company-wide is equally, if not more important. And so, and this is practical at certain company scales, like at Tilt, we were 100 people, and we would do this for we did weekly all hands. At every all hands, the growth team would get up there and talk about these ideas. And sometimes engaging the company was important. So we would do sometimes a guess which variant won game. And it was fun. It actually helped spark curiosity from different corners of the org on, hey, this intuition or kind of belief that I had on a certain part of the product was actually wrong. And the growth team went and kind of invalidated that. And so, communicating that out, I think live is best, and weekly growth team meetings, and then kind of some presence at regular all hands for probably the most impactful learnings specifically, I think is important.
Can I ask, what makes good learning versus bad learning?
It's hard to answer with precision. I think in general, a good learning is specific enough to impact the way you move forward on the next iteration of a product or strategy. And so a bad learning might be one that's not quantified or not specific enough to change your core product strategy. A bad learning also might be one that's just held within a single function and not propagate it out to impact other teams. And so, paid marketing is easy. Like, a learning that you get from spending millions of dollars on Facebook ads on like what creative or copy like resonates best, that should definitely inform your messaging on the product. And if those learnings don't kind of make its way out, like that's kind of it's a missed opportunity.
Yeah, I totally get you. I've actually seen some where there's ambiguity as to conversion, and so you misalign what caused an uptick in conversion, and it's actually not what you thought it was. So in certain cases, it was like, increasing spend on Facebook ads on Friday evenings, but that Friday evening also happened to be World Cup evening, where people were buying more X, and it then caused this misalignment because people then spent more on next Friday evening, and it wasn't the same, and so it led to like wrong actions.
Yeah, this is precisely why, by the way, having like a good analytics function in-house is really important, because like they'll keep you honest on experiment design. Sometimes it's going to be hard to isolate all the variables, but if you're running a test, like you need to hold other variables constant. And sometimes like software, as great as optimize your others might be, like won't capture this stuff.
Now, I have to dive into paid marketing. It's where you're an OG, according to so many people, but especially Mike, who you worked with at Stitchfix. You said that paid marketing is, I love this, an accelerant and not a crutch. Hit me, my man. What does that mean? Yeah,
well, it's funny because like I do harp on this stuff now. At Stitch Fix, my job was to run our marketing budget, right? And so like I learned there's a lot of power. Also with power comes great responsibility. And so there's a lot of lessons I learned here. Also a lot of stuff on what not to do, right? So what I mean by that comment, all right, take a step back. Like one measure of product market fit health is what happens when you turn off all non-organic acquisition activities. And so ideally you should see some ongoing user base that's retained and ideally generating new users, even if at a much slower clip, right? If you don't have that, you don't have product market fit. I think going too heavily into paid marketing too early can lead to a number of problems. Paid marketing is relatively simple and straightforward to go and acquire new users. And so it gets kind of addicting when you're more likely to design a single discipline marketing function and miss the opportunity to do more challenging kind of cross-functional initiatives when you see the magic of being able to put money into the Facebook machine and deliver users back. The thing that many people miss early on is that paid degrades with scale. Everyone says like, you'll get better at it, so you'll fight kind of the laws of gravity. That might happen in a short term, but on a long-term time horizon, performance always degrades. That's just how it works. And so you could really get false signal on early CACs as a business when at low volume and end up with a business maybe a year or two down the line whose economics just straight up don't work. And that can be very, very problematic. Given the speed of the feedback loops here, it's addicting. But I think if you haven't kind of like done the harder stuff up front, like you could really just head down a path you don't want.
Sorry, I'm just too interested. You've got so many things I want to pick up on, but what's too heavy? Just for founders listening, what's too heavy and what's the right mix early of like organic to paid?
Yeah, man. I mean, it's going to vary a lot by business, right? Like if you're a business that's like an e-commerce, store, I mean, you're probably going to be, 30 to 50% like paid marketing, right? And so like if you see business that's north of 50 for any type of business, that's probably like a flag. But again, this answer itself, this question itself is flawed, right? Because I think this goes back to the point of incrementality. Attributing a single source of acquisition to a given user is usually like a fallacy, right? And so I'm not dodging the question here, but I just think it's like even this line of thinking actually is part of the problem.
I saw the other day it takes 7 to 10 touch points with a brand for a single user to convert. So if we take that as an example, you could see the billboard on the highway and then also the Google ad and then the Facebook ad. And it's like, well, where do you attribute true success in terms of channel performance to?
Yeah. And the caveat on the answer on kind of like accelerant, not a crutch thing is like most businesses don't find their one channel that works. And so if it needs to be paid, like that might be okay. Just make sure you have enough room in your AOVs or customer value to support that. And so, the payback calculation is very important.
You said there about few people actually finding their channel. I'm with you. And then I have some companies that find it and it works. And I sit down with the teams and they go, but we need to diversify. And I'm like, you're getting too cute too soon. Yep. If it's working, just like pummel it. Yep. Do you agree, or am I actually leading them down the wrong path as most VCs do?
Completely agree with you. No, I do agree. Assuming that you're talking about early stage companies. Where I disagree is like once you're later stage, like I'll take a Stitchfix anecdote, right? Like this was around 2016, 2017, Cambridge Analytica. Do you remember the whole Cambridge Analytica thing? Basically like Facebook ads. There's a lot of kind of conspiracy on like what exactly made Facebook ads not performant for everyone at that time. But there was a period of time when like the shit just wasn't working for people and performance took a big hit basically across the board. And we had a constraint that I set with my team was we would not get more than 50% concentrated in any one channel, even if it were short-term optimal to do so. Because part of it, we were getting closer to IPO, but like you don't want to be too exposed to any one channel. And there's just at scale, there's a lot of kind of, just diversification risk. And so we actually weathered through that just fine. Even though Facebook took a hit, we were nimble enough to be reallocating during that time. We had a broad channel mix where we were running a pretty diverse portfolio at that time. But early on, I think I totally agree it could be problematic. And actually, there's all sorts of other reasons why you don't want to be too broad early on. Like it just makes measurement harder too. You're looking at more interactions between channels that are harder to capture. And so I think at scale, you want to be diversified. Early on, find your one. Ideally, that one channel is like not necessarily paid marketing, but yeah, I'm with you on that, Harry.
And you've done paid marketing at Stitchfix. You've done paid marketing at Tilt. You advise many companies now as an investor on paid marketing and doing it effectively. Broad, horrible question, but what have been some of the biggest lessons for you in terms of what it takes to do paid marketing really effectively, and where do people go wrong?
Well, I think I harped on this measurement thing earlier because I think, and look, this might be changing now with like the IDFA stuff and kind of ATT, which is its own conversation. But I think one of the lessons I had in doing this stuff at scale was I started buying Facebook ads in 2012. And at that time, there was a lot of alpha from just being like a savvy media buyer. And like the people I used to learn from and talk with were like these, basically degen growth types that, would just continue to try to find kind of like basically arbitrage opportunities. And I'm talking specific to Facebook, but this kind of applies across most channels. Like, that type of, alpha gets arbitraged away over time. And ultimately, what makes one great, or the only sustainable advantage on channels, is having great measurement, being sophisticated measurement, and then having great volume of creative and great creative that performs. And so ultimately, like, the practice of performance marketing gets back down to, do you have a unique kind of user hypothesis and are you generating creative that resonates with them at enough scale? And so like some of the biggest, most impactful changes we made at Stitch Fix were lowering the bar to actually like creative content we just put out there. So rather than having very high produced kind of TV kind of quality video assets, let people shoot stuff on an iPhone, just get a lot more out there and feed it into the algo. I think the biggest lesson I will go back to is incrementality testing as like a real North Star. And this is like so many marketers just rely on these either overly simplistic last click attribution models, which give basically 100% of your credit to one channel, which oftentimes looks like search just because it's the most high intent channel you have in your mix. Or like some black box model that you're paying millions of dollars a year for to go and assign fractional credit and try to get you precision on like optimizing your channel mix down to a T. Like the reality is, impact is rarely that direct. And so that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be measuring stuff. And I think a lot of brand marketing gets, it's kind of like, hey, this is marketing that's not measured. I would argue actually brand marketing should be held to performance guidelines just on a longer time horizon. But incrementality testing, I think, involves running holdouts across channels that actually incur a cost, but help you. I'll take a TV example, right? So this is actually an anecdote at Stitch Fix. TV was an important channel for us over time, and we ran it out of our performance marketing group. It wasn't a brand marketing channel. Typically, when you're running TV, the measurement method you will use is called spike analysis. So run a spot, and you get post logs back from whoever you're buying TV from, basically down to the minute. If you look at, call it a 7-minute window around the time a spot airs, the lift in traffic above what their baseline traffic should be at that time gets attributed back to TV, and then you could apply conversion assumptions, and that's kind of who comes in. That's going to make your TV look very expensive, right? Because like that's ignoring any halo effect or kind of lift on other channels. And so for us, like when we wanted to decide, hey, how much do we want to scale up TV? We ran, and we were public when we did this. We were getting a bunch of like analysts covering us, being like, hey, Stitch Fix went off TV, like are there problems? But we ran an 8-week holdout test where we actually paused national TV advertising. And we would always buy nationally because it was a lot cheaper from a CPM standpoint to do so. We paused national for 8 weeks. We picked 5 regions and we went and bought local TV spots. And we measured the overall lift in those markets and the interaction between other channels that we were running, and came up with awesome insights on actually what was the interplay from TV on our Facebook ads and what was actually the true kind of like incremental CPA. And when you understand incrementality, you could actually go back into your kind of whatever attribution model you're using, whether it be last click or whatever, and go and apply incrementality multipliers to them. And then you actually are getting, maybe the sense of precision that a lot of growth marketers are looking for. But without incrementality testing, you could be drawing like very wrong conclusions on kind of how your channels are working.
I love that example. My question to you when I was listening to that is, okay, if I'm a founder, how do I know how to allocate budget to paid marketing? Like, what's too much? What's too little? I know it's a really base question, but like, how much?
Yeah, well, I think, there's kind of tops down and bottoms up. I think maybe most teams should actually have some return on ad spend, like either ROAS or kind of payback threshold. And so it really comes down to like what's economical for your business at any point in time. And you could be tight with payback. So like most consumer companies, if you're not paying back, like if you're a subscription business, you're not paying back within a year, that's probably problematic. Ideally, if you're e-commerce, you're paying it back on first transaction because, a year is making all these conversion and repeat assumptions that you might not have at that point. And so I do think ultimately payback period is probably the guiding metric that you want to make that decision. At Stitchfix, like from a gross margin payback contribution margin payback standpoint, like a year was our final threshold, I think, but we had enough data on what was repeat, where we kind of were able to like be like relatively kind of tight on that. But yeah, the how much kind of ultimately I think should boil down to whatever payback makes sense for your business. And typically that's either going to be first transaction or like some period of time.
Yeah, I totally get you. I want to finish on one small question of CAC to LTV, which kind of is a metric that defines so much of founders' decks in our industry. Why do you think it's a flawed metric, my friend?
Yeah. So there's two primary flaws with it. I think one is just this notion of lifetime, which is the L in LTV. Like early in a company's journey, it's rare to have a real idea of what a reasonable customer lifetime is. Like if you're 2 years in, like how are you going to say you have a 5-year lifetime? Like it's really, so that's obviously flawed. And then it's also, too coarse. So I think many companies will look at this on a blended basis and disregard that there's actually a bunch of variance in customer quality by channel, keyword, audience, et cetera. And so the better method, which I was kind of getting at, was payback period, which removes the notion of lifetime, but also it could be calculated on a more granular level. And so, payback's the however months of growth margin it costs to pay back the initial incremental CPA. You want to make sure you're calculating this paid over paid. So use paid CAC, not blended CAC. And then with scale, you could get to more granularity. So not only looking at it on a channel level, but actually a keyword level. So at Stitchfix, you should have different basically CAC thresholds for someone who's bidding on or someone who's actually searching for, high price dresses versus kind of discount shoes, right? That's the important thing. One caveat on all this stuff, I think, and I'll go back to Bill Gurley was on our board at Stitchfix, and I remember he once wrote an article people should read called the Dangerous Seduction of the LTV Formula. I remember I first learned about this the night before presenting at my first board meeting there, where I was presenting like our new paid acquisition strategy as the guy that came in to like scale up our ad budget. And I was just terrified, but he's right. Like one of the important points he made there is this is a tool and not a strategy. I think too many performance marketers use this formula as a way to justify more budget. And so many people out there are like competing on the size of budgets that they manage. And there's these weird kind of power dynamics and stuff. Like I think at a certain point, having a deeper understanding of user psychology and being great at creative provides more of an edge than some of this kind of like mechanical kind of LTV CAC optimization. So anyway, I made a few different points there, but I think the primary flaws, again, I just think this notion of lifetime is the main one, but also like the granularity, you're able to get at that better if you have a payback kind of framework.
I think for me, it's also just like two things, which is on the customer acquisition cost. As you said, it most often when you do paid, it goes to the most specific and targeted first. And so it'll always be lower and it'll get worse over time, one. And two, on the flip side, it doesn't take into account word of mouth and brand marketing becoming more and more effective over time, which is like Stitch Fix could have seen actually a reduced CAC because daughters talk to their mothers and mothers talk to their sisters and sisters talk to their aunts. And suddenly you're not actually paying the same CACs, but it doesn't take into account any of that.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean?
Totally. Yep.
So I totally agree. Listen, I want to do a quick fire round, Mike. So I say a short statement, you give me your immediate thoughts. Is that okay?
Sure, let's do it.
James Bashar question. What did you believe about growth 5 years ago that you no longer believe?
that growth solves all problems, which is something we used to say back then. But I think growth might mask certain problems, but there's always second order effects and subsequent hills to climb. So it's important to be deliberate and strive for control versus having a growth at all cost mindset.
Andy Weissman submitted, how do you best prepare? What do you do to surrender to the flow? I don't really get this, but what do you do to surrender to the flow?
Well, I love that Andy found a way to squeeze in a reference from the best band in the world. Outside of reading the Helping Friendly book, I would just say conversations with smart, curious people from a wildly diverse set of backgrounds leads to eternal joy and never-ending splendor. So I'll leave it at that.
Fantastic. Thanks, Andy. Great shout. What would you say is the biggest mistake founders make when hiring growth teams?
I'll give two. Not referencing deeply enough to contextualize what growth means in that hires company. So hiring a head of marketing to go run a product function might not work out. And then also the second is probably assuming that growth is just the growth team's job and setting your org up that way. The person's just destined to fail.
We mentioned James Bashara. Lessons from Tilt on scalable versus non-scalable growth.
Yeah, I mean, the meta lesson at Tilt was about focus. But if I go down to growth, I would say the main lesson, one lesson for me personally, was around over-incentivizing usage. We knew that we had a product that grew contributor acquisition through organizer retention. And so that was our kind of growth model. We often incentivized organizers to come back. Once someone gets hooked on a promo, even if it's small, it's very hard to go back to non-incentivized behavior. And so I took this lesson into Stitchfix. We never discounted any product there, which is rare for e-com actually, and was a core part of the company's discipline. So it would come down to over incentivizing kind of usage.
What would you most like to change about the world of growth?
People assuming that it's a set of micro optimizations versus a holistic kind of system, which can include big bets.
Speaking of it kind of being much bigger than just micro optimizations, I'm just too intrigued. Do you think we'll see many more growth practitioners in the next few years, or do you think it will continue to be this bluntly quite exclusive club?
I hope we see more, and I also hope we see more heads of product and heads of marketing that actually just understand these principles and roll that into their functions. And so, yes, I think this discipline is kind of making its way out there. I don't know whether that shows up in titles, but yes, I do think it will continue to accelerate.
I totally agree with you. I think most often it's probably ego and insecurity. But I speak as a VC and you as a VC too, so we're not ego or insecure. Just kidding. I've only interviewed 3,000. Listen, final one, my friend. What recent company growth strategy, or company growth strategy, I'll give it to you, have you been most impressed by?
All right. I'll reference Fair another time. I think their B2B referral mechanic was insanely powerful. And early on, that was really the only thing that was working for growth and that continued to carry them this far. I think referral systems and referral engines, typically there's always more juice from a referral program to squeeze than companies realize, but they typically are thought of in a consumer context. I think Fair's B2B marketplace pulling in cross-site referrals, that was huge. And I totally admired the way that they built that and kind of scaled it out over time. So that's probably the one that I go to.
Mike, I've absolutely loved this. I can't thank you enough for putting up with my deviations away from schedule, but you've been fantastic. So thank you so much for joining me today, my friend.
Really enjoyed it, Harry. Thanks for having me.